This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien starts the show highlighting information from the USDA Ag Outlook Forum and how future prices are looking. Justin Waggoner, K-State Extension beef cattle specialist, keeps the show rolling as he discusses the importance of good customer service in the agriculture industry. Concluding the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond as he explains how Kansas has seen rain, fire, and snow within the past week and what else we can be expecting. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Daniel, what USDA forum is currently taking place?
It's the annual Ag Outlook Forum in Washington, D.C. It's sort of the USDA show. And they get the first official word on what their expectations are for the overall U.S. ag economy. Typically, it's a place where we get fairly conservative numbers. Really, you might say the biggest data that we're looking for coming out of this conference this year will be what the USDA thinks will happen for just crop acreage. They'll talk about in the commodity outlooks, and that happens on the second day. Today on Friday, we'll get the specifics of what they think for the supply-demand balance sheets, et cetera. So thought-provoking in terms of how the market will respond to this. I think they'll gladly take in the information, but will be circumspect, thoughtful with regard to what they think actually finally happens. So even though we just have the preliminary numbers, the general idea of what crop size will be and something of prices, let's talk about that some again. I think there'll be a lot more analysis of this in coming days, actually today on Friday, but also Monday, Tuesday, we'll digest this and we'll gain a consensus on what people think. But biggest information coming out of this would, again, be the planted acreage figures projected by the USDA to have in 2026 a total planted acreage for U.S. corn of 94 million acres. That number actually is below the pre-report trade estimate by 1 million. The analysts coming into this had average guesses about 95 million acres, down about 3.8 million from last year when we got it up to 98.8. So now if we come in at 94, that's below the average trade guess. So, potentially a little bit positive for U.S. corn. I would say that since we're talking corn, their projection for the size of the crops, 15.8 billion bushels. Of course, we had 17 plus billion bushels in 2025 and are dealing with the repercussions of that in terms of supply-demand balances, et cetera. Projected exports to be down a little bit, still 3.1 billion bushels, down from what the February 10th projection of 3.3 would be the second highest on record behind what we have going on this year, projected to be 3.3. Before that, the highest we'd ever seen was 2.7. But we have lower acreage, lower production estimated, with a little lower production, usage somewhat level. Again, exports still strong. Biofuels, 5.6 billion. They have a average projected price just slightly above where we're at this year at $4.20, up a dime from where we're at this go around. So interesting to see how that all works out. I guess that farmers will vote with their planters come spring with regard to what they're going to do. And I think you stand back and look at it. Also, corn prices of late have been more levelish than what we've seen for soybeans and even for wheat. So I guess the USDA is following the idea that a little bit lower prices now probably aren't as much of an incentive for farmers to plant corn as somewhat higher soybean prices that we've been seeing. So interesting. Then for soybeans, the USDA projected 85 million acres to be planted, and that's exactly what the trade was thinking would occur. coming into this information with a production amount of 4.45 billion bushels. That's just slightly higher than the USDA's estimate. So in there, you could back out what the average yields are. So that's what'll come next week after we dig into this and into the details of it. Exports 1.7 billion bushels. We're at about 1.575 this year. So there's a projection that the U.S. Exports of beans will move to the higher side from where they're at right now. We'll see. That really is dependent on what happens between the U.S. and China and the size of South American crop. They project higher biofuel use. I need to dig into the specifics, but there's optimism with regard to how the 45Z rules will incentivize in the soybean crush part of the balance sheet. So we'll see. They did project prices at $10.30 for the 26-27 marketing year starting September 1st of this year. And that would be, again, just like for corn, 1 dime higher than where we were last year the current year projected at $10.20. So we'll see how that all works out. I guess we're waiting to see details on other crops. I'll be really curious to see where we end up on wheat planted acreage. It looks like for the first day, early projections were for 45 million acres of wheat to be planted in the U.S., and that includes hard red winter, soft red winter, et cetera, basically all the winter wheat types, as well as spring wheat, durum, and all that. We planted 45.3 million acres last year for the 25-26 marketing year, projected to be just a little bit lower this go around. The trade was thinking we'd be at about 44.7 million acres. So obviously we're just shaving hairs with regard to the details of it. So preliminary numbers, they're thinking that corn acreage be down really about 3.5 to 4 million acres. Soybeans to be up about 4 or so as well. So it's kind of just a trade going on, and wheat to continue its sideways move. I'm really looking forward to seeing what sorghum does for Kansas. If they figure that sorghum will follow a similar trend to corn in terms of reduction in acres, then you'd think things will end up being lower by some degree, a percent or two on sorghum. But if their focus is more on China staying strong in the export purchase market from the United States, could go the other way. So I guess we'll see. So as we talk, that conference heading towards closing up here later in the afternoon. We'll have more specific discussions of these crops as we go through the day on here on Friday, and we'll see what news finally comes out of this. So I guess so far, not a lot to look at on this. I think we gather in this information, then we look to the futures, we see how the markets respond.
What are we seeing for futures, Daniel?
As we look at corn market futures, I don't know exactly where today will end up, but the trend we've been having for, let's say, March corn futures for the lead contract net complex, again, we had on the day of the January report, I think that was January the 12th, huge drop, 20-some cents, and then had a drop from about 448 or so down to the lowest about 420, so 21 cents or so, and then it had trended up in a fairly consistent fashion. Basically for about 3 to 4 weeks, got up to as high as about 435. And since that time, have been just kind of struggling sideways on corn. During that time, we've still had pretty decent corn exports, but just not a lot of other factors that the market's responding to in a positive way. Overall, closed yesterday at $4.25 We'll see what happens where it finally closes today. Indicators of market momentum, about 45 or so, 45% out of 50. 50 would be level, just kind of moving to the low side. So corn been generally moving lower, as opposed to soybeans, which have had a strong rise in the last, basically from January, we're as low as about 1040, or literally $1 higher than that right now. And again, we've had pretty decent movement for soybean exports. China's come into the U.S. market, bought soybeans. That's probably the biggest single factor. Watching what's happening in South America in terms of their ability to supply China as the major buyer and others. We're just kind of hanging around 50% on relative strength indices for corn. We're at bullish levels for soybeans, over 70% for an RSI indices. I guess we'll see. I hope I'm saying this right and not offending folks or causing them to wonder if I'm seeing things right. But how confident is the market in that soybean planting number? that will move up almost 3.5 to 4 million acres in soybeans. And OS, by the way, will offset that by taking about 3.5 to 4 million acres out of corn. And by the way, I should mention this in the last week, export numbers, we had a strong week. It seems to be indicated for grain sorghum up. I think we're at about the numbers that we've been looking at. I think we're at 8 to 10 million bushels exported. So that's tremendous. For hard red winter, we had in the last day or so a strong move to the high side. Need to understand what all that's about, but we have some indications of a cold snap coming that could very well be a factor that's causing worry and for winter wheat varieties, particularly for us. So I guess we're watching this in real time with regard to answering the question: will cold weather coming here and at this stage, given where our wheat's at in Kansas and states to the south, are we vulnerable? We shall see. So we closed yesterday at $5.65. That's up. In January, we were closer to like 5.15 or so. So we're 50 cents higher. What a great thing. And that's in the lead contract. As you look out into the harvest contract for 5.65.5 yesterday for March, for July 5.88.5. So we're starting to see some movement in that market. So anyway, corn, we're kind of sideways on our expectations right now in mid to late February. But for these other crops, we're seeing actually some fairly substantial price strength that's occurring, and we'll see where that takes us over the next 30 to 60 days.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner with this month's Management Minute. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, this month, wanting to talk about tips to improve customer service. And commonly when I think about agriculture, customer service is not the first thing that pops to my mind. And so why is this something that you see as important?
Yeah, so, I think you're not alone in that. And so, oftentimes I kind of like to offer the background of, what was the intent behind the article, and because these are really short, articles that we put out. And so as I start to think about just agriculture and kind of some of the new spaces and the new ways that we're marketing things, and, we've got many producers that are now looking at farm to table type marketing opportunities that might be out there. We've got all the social media outlets to market things. We now oftentimes market cattle on a video auction. And so, customer service is a big part of that. Oftentimes, how we interact with clients that may be calling about something that we're selling, or if we're engaged in one of those programs. And so I really wanted to lean on what's out there in terms of just how do we provide good customer service. And I know in agriculture, especially with producers, we don't think about that a lot, right? And oftentimes, we haven't been accustomed to operating within the retail space, and so a little bit. And so as we see operations start to move into that, that was really the impetus behind kind of starting a conversation around customer service. And so that was essentially was the why, right? And so I think one of the ways to accurately describe customer service, right, that I think describes a good customer experience, service experience really well is, if you've ever had that interaction that says, wow, that was great, right? It really doesn't matter where that was at, whether that was at a restaurant or if that was at a store or retail space, like you really feel like, wow, that was a really great experience. And so we have to start breaking that down and getting a little more accustomed to, what aspects made or gave us that feeling as a consumer, right? What are the aspect of that? We certainly don't want to be cold in that transaction. So what are some elements of customer service, and how do we break that down? And then, we can tie it back to the agricultural side and the space just a little bit there.
And what is one of those very first elements when it comes to starting the customer service experience?
So I think the first step, as we start to engage with consumers within the ag space, right, and is oftentimes there's a point of contact, right? And so answer the phone, be responsive to emails, or if that's through social media marketing outlets, answering those messages, right? Be responsive. People want to engage with a person. Now, I think oftentimes, in my own experiences, that can become overwhelming very quickly, right? So you have to balance that, especially as those are kind of coming in, right? So, be committed to engaging in the process. I guess that's how I would describe, answer the phone, address be responsive as you can. I think secondly, as we look at the retail space, it's really important not to make promises that you can't keep. Be upfront about, what you're marketing. This is, be descriptive, be accurate. Say what you have, say what you're going to do, and do what you said you were going to do, right? I think that's as the old adage goes. Just make sure you're being very truthful, as honest and upfront as you can in those interactions. And then I think the third aspect of customer services is really listening to those consumers, right? Those people that are reaching out. What are their questions? What are their needs? What are they looking for in this transaction? We all know that there's a lot of information if we look at consumers that are out there, say, a seed stock producer, in terms of what that client needs from those bulls. What's important to their operation? What aspects are you focusing on? Are you looking for maternal traits? Are you looking for carcass traits? Do you retain ownership? So it's asking some of those good questions, right? And listening to the needs of that person that's on the other side of the transaction. The other aspect that I thought was really interesting is, be helpful even if you don't necessarily make the sale. That a lot of times we know consumers may engage with a particular retail outlet several times before there's a transaction. And so, building that relationship, even though we don't make the sale today, I think it's always good to not lose sight of that aspect of customer service. And the other aspect I think in here gets a little bit, doesn't necessarily apply to all operations, right? Some operations have a staff. I think about some experiences I've had in the commercial cattle feeding industry. How do we train our staff to do customer service, right? Are there things there where we can, rather than just talking to the manager or the owner operator, are there people that are closer to X, right? That can maybe be more engaged in the process, more accurately describe what's maybe going on with a particular set of cattle, right? How do we kind of engage our staff and those people, they might be closer to some of those transactions than others, right? So, and then the other big part of this, and some of these, don't necessarily cross over into the ag space, but I really thought was kind of interesting here is a big part is, as you think about customer service and that, wow, that was great feeling at the restaurant or the retail segment, think about what happens when things don't go well. What do they do oftentimes? They put in something extra saying, hey, acknowledge the mistake, right? We all make mistakes. We all get the orders wrong, but here's something in additional. Here's something that we can throw on the table. Here's that coupon. Here's that discount for that next visit that you're going to make and engage with us. And so those are just some really good things that I think that have some carryover into ag, especially as we see producers start to get into some different segments and maybe start to take on some of these different entrepreneurial, farm to table type aspects of an operation.
I feel like a lot of times when it comes to customer service, the customer, whether it's over the phone or over email, is asking all of the questions, but is it important to also take the time for the person who's answering those phone calls and emails to also ask questions?
Yeah, I describe that as just simply establishing a dialogue, right? Of making sure, good communication skills, right? Hey, did I, asking that follow-up question, hey, did I address your question? Did I address your concern? I think that's a good point that you bring up.
Is it important to try to go into the mindset also of the customer is always right when handling service calls?
I think so. I think that's generally accepted. The customer is always right, especially in those instances where something didn't work out, right? How do we fix it? A big part of providing that good customer service is, okay, I hear your concern, right? And then where do we go from here?
And Justin, working in Extension, you get to work with a lot of people across Kansas and I'm sure other states as well. What have been some skills you've developed to help interact and understand how you're able to help that stakeholder?
I think in Extension, we definitely operate within the customer service space, and so it's kind of interesting. This is, where the conversation here's gone today. But I think, for myself, I think learning to ask good questions, especially as we get into identifying, the needs of the client or the consumer on the other side of that. What are your goals and objectives, right? What are you looking for? I think those are probably, asking those questions are very important in those conversations. As I work with producers, formulating rations or addressing production problems, oftentimes asking good questions can go a long ways towards advancing the conversation and really gaining some insightful information about what the problem may be, or getting to the root cause of something.
Justin, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. If you'd like to read more on this topic of customer service, I will link K-State's Animal Sciences and Industry newsletter that has this article in it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you'd like to check out more things on ASI's newsletter, you can find it by going to asi.k-state.edu. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Deputy Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation, Brooke Appleton, as they discuss how the Agriculture Department has issued the final payments to producers eligible through the Emergency Livestock Relief Program.
Now issued, the final payments within USDA's Emergency Livestock Relief Program.
An automatic second payment to eligible producers who received an initial payment for drought and wildfire losses.
Deputy Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation Brooke Appleton explains that second payment is equal to over 8% of an eligible producer's 2023 or 2024 Livestock Forage Disaster Program gross calculated payment.
This second payment will get all these producers closer to a little over 42% of their total losses for 2023 and 2024.
In addition,
we determined that a payment factor is not needed. So producers with approved ELRP 2023 and 2024 applications are receiving 100% of their calculated payment in a single lump sum.
Explaining payments are issued through the drought and wildfire and flood and wildfire components of ELRP. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, in Kansas this past week, I feel like we've seen a wide variety of things from fire, rain, and you told me earlier, snow also. And where has this all been taking place?
Yeah, if we summarize all that seems to me like typical springtime weather in Kansas, but the calendar still says February. So there's some confusion going on. But yeah, we've had a really extreme weather flip and flop over the course of the last week with it all started this past weekend. We had a good rain event, especially for eastern and central Kansas. Even parts of northwest Kansas got into the moisture, and they really, really needed it. Rainfall amounts this weekend, we saw the highest amounts along the I-35 corridor, especially from Wichita to Kansas City. As much as 3 inches fell just over the weekend. We even had our first severe weather reports out of southeast Kansas this weekend with both a couple of wind and hail reports. We get further west, northwest Kansas, those folks that were going up as much as 80 days without a wetting rain, at least a tenth of an inch of moisture, they got up to 0.8 of an inch in places around Goodland to Colby and southward towards Tribune. Good moisture amounts, much needed, especially considering we were developing some pretty big deficits in precipitation over the last 30 days in both Northwest and portions of the East. Still, Southwest Kansas missed the precipitation, and that kind of set the stage, unfortunately, for a pretty impactful wind event that we had on Tuesday into Wednesday. We had strong southwest winds gusting up to 60 miles an hour. That resulted in, unfortunately, several fires that developed in Oklahoma and in a few even in Kansas. And they pushed to the north and east into Kansas and burned, unfortunately, a lot of land in portions of Ashland, Seward, Meade counties, and even Comanche County. So that's unfortunate. We've been talking a lot about how the heavy grass loading from last year's really impressive growing season just sets the stage for big fires across the Kansas landscape. Unfortunately, that happened earlier than normal. I mean, we're not even into our peak fire season, which is in March and April. So as we moved later into the week, we had an impactful cold front that came through on Thursday and finally reset temperatures. We've been just crazy warm. We think about that rain last weekend. After a storm system with that much rain, usually we have a cold side or a cold front that comes through. Temperatures actually were really warm during that rain event. And afterwards, we had near record temperatures for most of the state, especially the low temperatures. Some areas in eastern Kansas didn't get below 50 degrees for like 48 hours. The average highs are in the mid 40s. And so that's way, way, way too warm for Kansas. But the cold front was much needed. Drop temperatures, we're going to be slightly below average from now into the weekend, even into Monday, which would be welcomed. It also kind of slows things down. Things are starting to green up, but it's also going to bring some snow too. We're going to have a light dusting of snow up to about an inch in portions of western and central Kansas. Friday night into Saturday, overall, not a high impact event. Soil temperatures are ridiculously warm. They're in the mid 40s for 7-day averages. That would put us at planning in early March, which obviously hopefully won't happen, but hopefully we get some cooler weather in here to maybe offset some of the recent warmth.
When we look at the forecast, what can we be expecting?
Yeah, so up and down temperatures, we're going to rebound mid next week with warmer temperatures. Unfortunately, it looks like we're going to see a return to some wind as well, both early week and then again later in the week with maybe another system by Friday. And that's going to take us into March. And, I'm looking at the overall weather pattern, very active weather pattern expected. So we're going to get these ebbs and flows where we get really, really warm and then we get slightly cooler. There's not a lot of cold air built to our north and west right now, so we won't get real cold. But unfortunately, most of the precipitation looks to be favored off to our east, and we stay overall dry. So that means increased wind events as well with these cold frontal passages and continuing fire weather concerns as we go into March.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.